So in this video, I'm going to show you how to conduct a chi-square test of independence. And so what you would use a chi-square test for is when you have two categorical or nominal variables, and you want to see whether the distribution of observations across these two variables are, sort of what you would expect if this was done at random or not. So for this example, what I'm going to show you is, let's say that our question is whether high, low, and mid poverty schools are randomly distributed across counties in New Jersey. And so for that, you'll see that I already have Stata open, and I already have a data set loaded. And this data set is school level, so each observation is a school. This data comes from the New Jersey Department of Education, and it's from the 2018-19 school year. So this data set has all public schools in New Jersey in 2018-19. And again, so our question is whether high, medium, and low poverty schools are sort of randomly distributed across counties in New Jersey. So our two variables are county, which is just a name, right? So a purely categorical variable. And then we have another variable called poverty, which is also categorical because it's, high, medium, and low, and that isn't necessarily like, a medium poverty school is not necessarily doesn't have twice as much poverty or something, for instance, that you would expect if that were a continuous variable. So to do that, and this is just for background, what I did was there's a variable in this data set that shows the percentage of students in each school who are identified as economically disadvantaged. What I did was I created this variable called poverty that has three different categories. So the rule that I used was fewer than 30% of students economically disadvantaged meant that it was a low poverty school. 30 to 70% of students being identified as economically disadvantaged, I called that a mid-poverty school. And in a school with more or greater than 70% of the students identified as economically disadvantaged, I called that a high poverty school. If you were doing this, like where you would set those cut points and decide those categories would all just be dependent on your research question and the data that you're using. So this is just for illustrative purposes only. And so there's this variable poverty, which has a value of 1, 2, and 3. So 1 would be a low poverty school, 2 is a medium poverty school, and 3 is a high poverty school. So this just shows the distribution of those. So there's, you can see how many schools are identified as low, medium, and then high poverty. I could do the same thing for county. So we'll show how many schools are in each of the counties that are in the state. Also, one thing to note is here, charters is listed as a county variable because charter schools don't exist within a geographic district. So just note that. But let's say we want to see, well, what's the breakdown of schools based on, extent of poverty across counties. So I just create a cross tab. And so this is a combination of these two tables, right? So it shows for each county, how many schools are there in total, and then how many low poverty, mid poverty, and high poverty schools are there. But, of course, what we would expect is that small counties are going to have fewer high poverty schools, for instance, just because they're smaller counties, like they have fewer schools. Larger counties, on the other hand, like, say, Bergen County here, you would expect there to be more high poverty schools there, just, if this was all at random, just because there are more schools, because, overall, about 17% of schools in the state are high poverty. So if you kind of scroll down here, you can, you kind of start to take a look and you say, well, Atlantic County has over 25% of its schools are high poverty. Down here in Bergen County, actually, it is about 3% of its schools are identified as high poverty schools. And so that seems a little bit, that's obviously lower than the average of 17%. Atlantic County was a little bit higher. Burlington County, less than 2% of its schools are high poverty, so that's much less than the statewide, than the overall average of 17%. But what this doesn't tell you is like you kind of get a feel by just looking at this in this way. Like, okay, some counties do appear to be slightly more affluent, meaning fewer high poverty schools, and some counties seem to be more economically distressed by the number of showing a higher proportion of high poverty schools. But what we can do is we can actually test and see whether that is consistent with sort of just random variation, or whether this distribution shows that there are systematic or significant differences across county in terms of the sort of poverty level of its schools. And so an easy way to do that is we just take the table that we just made, and then we add a comma, and then as an option we just type chi2, C-H-I, and then the number 2, and then it gives us the same table again. But what you see down here is it will give you a p-value. So in this case, the p-value is much less than 0.05, which is the threshold that we use for statistical significance. And so what we would conclude is that the distribution of schools by poverty across counties is not consistent with sort of random sorting. And if you're thinking to yourself about like, well, how much more can you interpret out of this? And it's sometimes it can be limited, in terms of what you can tell with chi-square analysis, because there might be some counties that are really driving this relationship, but this doesn't tell you. So this p-value just tells you whether across all of these counties there is sorting or a distribution that's consistent with randomness or independence or not. And so we can say that what we see here is not consistent with poverty being independent of county. But you would need to use different tools or different analyses, or kind of change your research question to get into more detail about like which counties and things like that. So that's how you would do chi-square analysis using Stata.